the loneliness epidemic, climate change, the worsening mental health crisis, low-paying jobs and record-high housing prices. To many people, all of these issues rise from a single culprit: capitalism. I've talked about these problems in length on this channel, and in every one of these videos, there are at least a handful of comments attributing the problem to our capitalist economic system. Here's the thing though, most of these comments never expand upon their thinking. They just say capitalism bad, which leads me to think that people have a very one-dimensional perspective on this. Surely we can't chalk up all modern issues to this often misrepresented word, right? But if they're right about capitalism, what other option do we have? Should we find a way to improve upon our current system, or tear the whole thing down and start from scratch? I am by no means an economist or expert on this topic, so please try to remember that before you get triggered and run to the comments section. But I am going to try to answer these questions and educate you guys and hopefully myself through this video. Let's start by defining the broadest term of capitalism that we can to give us a basis for our understanding. Capitalism is an economic system by which a society's means of production are held by private individuals or organizations, not the government. In a purely capitalist economy, products, prices, and the distribution of goods are determined mainly by competition in a free market. Anyone, technically anyone, has the ability to start a business, own property, and compete with other businesses in a certain market without the government mandating how they function or how much they make to a certain extent. And I say to a certain extent for several reasons. On the state level, the government sets a minimum wage, which is the minimum amount you're allowed to pay your workers, barring some exceptions. There are also some mandatory workplace safety laws business owners must abide by, though these aren't very strict, as we will find out later in the video. And it's the government's duty to ensure there's a level playing field for all market participants too. This is why you can't consider the United States or pretty much any other country to be a purely capitalist country, because there's always instances of policies that are closer to economic systems like socialism thrown in there. But outside of most of these things, it's up to the individual to work and create ownership over something that can make a profit. Under capitalism, the main driving forces of the economy are a pursuit of profit and self-interest above everything else. Prices of things are determined based on supply and demand, which essentially means a higher demand leads to an increase in prices and output by producers. And the greater supply helps level prices out to the point that only the strongest competitors remain. So let's start with the good. You'll often hear the term capitalism breeds innovation from pro-capitalists, and that's been shown to be true to an extent. Because consumers are free to choose the products they desire, they are the ones controlling the supply of what gets made and how it gets made. This calls for companies to create ever more efficient products at lower costs to the consumer, which are supposed to improve the living conditions of the consumers ever more, though that is often debatable too. This is why the cell phone went from a brick with very limited battery that could only be bought by the rich to the handheld, sometimes reasonably priced pocket device with tons of useful features that it has today. Yes, smartphones come with loads of drawbacks, and I'll probably address those later in the video, but these are the types of advancements that improve the quality of life for the average consumer because consumers created the demand for an ever-evolving phone, which incentivized companies who wanted to keep making more money to innovate on what they had already created. The same can be said of other industries such as the automobile industry. For example, during the era of the Soviet Union, the access to cars remained difficult and stagnant, and improvements weren't really worked on as there was less of an incentive to improve upon it. After all, it was the state that owned the car companies, not individuals. But in capitalist economies, there was a huge desire to make the car more affordable and more efficient, leading to it becoming Americans' main form of transportation. Albeit not the greatest thing to have your cities built around, as I'm sure most Americans are now aware of, but still a great example of how the market self-regulates based on consumer demand. And of course, we can't ignore how much general living conditions have improved under capitalism for the average person. Only about 100 years ago, the average life expectancy was around 31 years old, and that increased so much largely due to a huge reduction of infant mortality and improvements to living conditions. Most people were living off less than 2,000 calories a day, with porridge and bread being a staple in their diet. The share of humanity living on less than $2 per day adjusted for inflation went from 85% in 1800 to just 9% in 2019. Though I will say, if we look at the federal federal poverty level rates, which is based on a yearly income, it hasn't gone down at all for the past few decades. In the developed world, capitalism did transform almost everyone into a wage laborer, but it also lifted them out of poverty and made them much more prosperous than early socialists predicted. Advancements to science and health are also incentivized by a capitalist market, fueling a lot of modern-day discoveries that have greatly helped the average person to live longer and feel better. So when people say capitalism bad without providing any further context, I can only conclude that they barely have any concept of what life was like 100 years ago for the average person. Things are objectively better now in terms of quality of life in almost every regard. But as with any economic system, there are flaws and imperfections that lead to certain aspects of a country getting worse, and capitalism certainly is no exception to that. The underlying essence to almost every private business under capitalism is how can we increase productivity and profits as much as possible without having to pay workers more? And the impact of that line of thinking is being felt more than ever. Companies often don't think about the morals or ethics of their products, or even whether they're really useful to the consumer, but rather what keeps the consumer coming back. Social media is a prime example of this, and this is one of those blessings, but also big curses to the innovation brought about by capitalism. These devices are designed to keep you hooked on these platforms as long as possible. And while these companies do tell you to set limits on your phone usage, like Apple's screen time settings to help you stay off their phone that's baked into their software, they know that in order for them to keep making more money, you have to stay hooked on their product. In that way, you can say that capitalism is in fact indirectly tied to the loneliness epidemic, which really gained its full force during the rise of social media. Other reasons capitalism increases loneliness is because, as stated, its focus is most often on self-interest and profits rather than getting others to work together in a community. It breeds competition between markets rather than friendliness, and this reflects itself through our highly individualized modern-day culture. Speaking of Apple, branding is also a very powerful but often manipulative way of overcharging for items that don't deserve the price that they have. Luxury brands exude a sort of status from those who wear these items, and because capitalism incentivizes greed and self-interest over community, people naturally gravitate towards valuing how they are perceived to others, rather than whether a product is actually useful or not. An iPhone costs around $500 to make, but they sell it for $1,000, a 50% net profit margin that they can justify for a product that isn't even better than most phones just because they're Apple. Oh yeah, not to mention their business practices are often really shady too. There's also plenty of products out there that aren't even solving real problems, but rather fueling the rise in consumerism amongst the masses. Like, do we really need to buy a shareable divider thing for our Stanley cups or toilet bowl decorations? Do YouTubers already making millions of dollars a month really have to scam their audience by pumping and dumping a crypto coin or selling food that will only make young people feel more like shit? Ethics frequently go out the door for many people under capitalism at the prospect of getting as rich as possible if the cap for how much you can make is seemingly endless and you don't get punished for having bad ethics. You might have also heard the phrase, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. What this means is that capitalism is a system in which companies, in order to make a profit, pay workers less than the value their labor produces. If they didn't, then they just wouldn't be making money. So someone has to get the short end of the stick under capitalism, and it's almost always the workers. And the things that companies do to exploit their workers and the environment just to increase profits, sometimes heinous. One of the most evil companies in the world, Nestle, monopolizes water supplies in disenfranchised communities, aka communities deprived of their rights or privileges, extracts the water, then sells that water back to those same communities at a huge premium. In the 1970s, they were one of the main contributors to malnutrition and disease in global South countries for promoting their baby formula over breastfeeding. And if that wasn't enough for you, they also employ children. Yeah. The pro-capitalist argument to be made here is that most companies won't get to this level of unethical practice, and it's really up to the companies themselves to instill better morals within their managers, but with little government regulation, they just don't do that. Another argument one could make is, well, it's us consumers that control demand. If enough of us stop buying from the evil companies, they'll go out of business. While that is true to an extent and something we should all be practicing more, the problem is that many of the companies that employ the most evil business practices are the ones that can afford to price their goods at the cheapest market price. So for those who are poor, and this is especially true in regards to the food industry, they don't really have any other choice than to buy from those companies, keeping them in business indefinitely. And these same companies are often tied to the ones that are causing irreversible damage to the earth. Like I stated before, our economy is based on growth and increasing profits. And for the whole thing to continue to grow, you must ramp up the production of goods. This requires us to produce more things and throw more things away, but our planet has finite resources. We can't keep pulling more from the earth year after year and going over the limit required for Earth to replenish these things. And it's fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, and these industries within them that are doing more harm than anything else. The oil and gas industries are the most capitalized, profitable industries in the world. In the most ironic, dystopian fashion, fossil fuels reached record high sales in 2022, due in part to capitalism and supply and demand. We're running low on these resources, but the demand is still high, and therefore these companies can charge more for their fossil fuels. Climate change activists have been doing a lot to grow awareness around our increasingly hotter planet, but efforts to make the changes enacted upon by activists are often halted due to, well, capitalism. The fossil fuel industry, being the outrageously powerful industry that it is, often pays off government officials to keep those who are trying to slow down their production in the shadows. In the end, greed takes over as the primary incentive for a lot of companies under capitalism, and this is really where the flaws of capitalism start to become exposed. The equal opportunity for everyone to have a chance at wealth simply just isn't all that true, and most of the opportunities only lie in the hands who have already established power, which ironically is quite similar to the feudalism of the past. A lot of people use the game of Monopoly to illustrate this. Everybody starts on a level playing field, but as the game goes on and the strategic winners buy up all the property, only they get to enjoy their riches in the end. This isn't what a capitalist economy is supposed to look like. After all, isn't the government supposed to ensure a level playing field for all market participants through regulation, labor laws, and protecting consumers? Well, it's obvious that those promises are not working anymore, and many people believe this is always the end result of capitalism, which is now commonly referred to as late-stage capitalism. This is the only type of capitalism that generations like millennials and Gen Z have ever known, and it's a huge reason why they dislike it so much. While previous generations took advantage of the benefits of a growing economy without too much wealth inequality, they did not think about the effects this would have on the future, a common theme in capitalist economies. And this is what caused the terrible wages, income housing gap, and general unaffordability of all things we are now seeing today. The argument usually made by anti-capitalists is that there is no avoiding the end result of capitalism that we are now seeing. It's not even that this is just one of the economic variations that are a characteristic of capitalism. It's reaching a level where it will only continue to get worse and worse for the average working class citizen. And the answer I have to that is, it's more complicated than that. You see, there are different types of capitalism. There's laissez-faire capitalism, which involves minimal government intervention, free markets, and individual entrepreneurship. There's state capitalism, where the government plays a significant role in the economy, owning or controlling key industries while still allowing private enterprise. There's welfare capitalism, which provides extensive social welfare programs to support citizens, like universal healthcare and education. But what could most closely be associated with America's current form of capitalism is something along the lines of corporate capitalism, or as it's now sometimes referred to, a corporatocracy. This is when large corporations dominate the economy and have a significant influence on which governmental policies and practices are passed. If you saw my Death of the Middle Class video, you might remember me mentioning that a small minority of companies control the vast majorities of sales and money, and while this is true, the way that these companies are fueling the worsening power imbalance, lower wages, and inequality goes much deeper than that. Firstly, labor unions, aka workers who come together to advocate for better wages and working conditions, have become increasingly more rare. Just 1 in 20 workers in the US private sector are members of a trade union, down from more than 1 in 4 in the 1950s. It appeared to happen sometime around the 1980s, but during that time, it appears that US businesses declared war on unions and won. The wage gap between similarly qualified workers in different companies has also widened. One study found that 1/3 of the increase in the earnings gap from 1978 to 2013 occurred within firms, while 2/3 of the rise occurred between firms. It's the market power of one firm versus another that determines wages, rather than the power of a particular employer versus its workers. Thirdly, as previously stated, monopolization of sectors now exists, even though it's not supposed to the way it does now. Monopsonies like Amazon make it virtually impossible for many small businesses to thrive because they're able to produce so much more at such a lower price and therefore control the prices of almost everything. And in these sort of conditions, it's very difficult for workers to negotiate for better wages or better working conditions. Another thing we keep hearing about is the low unemployment rate and how that's a positive feature of capitalism. But that statistic tells much less of a story than it used to. Millions of workers have dropped out altogether, and those types of workers are not counted in the unemployment statistics. The chances of a prime-age man being in paid work has dropped by 8 percentage points in the post-war decades. For most of this period, women's employment rates were increasing, but in the US at least, that rise stopped abruptly around the turn of the century and has actually edged down slightly. Black, Hispanic, and less educated adults have all seen the sharpest drops in participation as well. As the value of the federal minimum wage floor continues to drop and workers have decreased power in how they are paid and treated, the inequality gap between the rich and the poor only continues to grow. As philosopher Elizabeth Anderson put it in her book Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It, CEOs are the new totalitarians who think of themselves as libertarian individualists while acting in practice as dictators of little communist governments. All because a select few at the top need to be making an absurd amount of money. All because of capitalism, right? Well, before we try to definitively answer that question, let's go back to what I first asked at the start of this video. What are some of the alternatives? Is socialism better? Is communism better? Or do we need to start something different entirely? When trying to answer these questions, it's important to look at what's worked in the past and what metrics need to be taken into account in order to consider something to be a good economic system. There's many factors we could take in, from quality of life, average mental health, well-being, living standards, healthcare access, and access to things like public services and infrastructure. But if we could distill all of these things into one sentence, I think most of us would agree that an economy's primary goal should be to increase the enjoyment and well-being of as many citizens in that economy as possible by increasing life satisfaction and lowering inequality. Is total equality possible? Almost definitely not. Even amongst economic systems that aim for equitable distribution, like socialism, there can be differences in income and rewards. And I don't know about you, but I personally don't think I want to live in an economy where everything is tried to be shared equally and the government can take away whatever you have. Either way, I think we should start with the places that have the highest life satisfaction and the lowest inequality and go from there. Based on various global reports, such as the World Happiness Report and the Gini Index, which is a measure of income inequality, the Nordic countries, such as Finland, Denmark, and Sweden, consistently rank the highest in terms of high life satisfaction and low inequality. And they run on something commonly referred to as the Nordic model. This system blends aspects of capitalism with comprehensive welfare programs and social safety nets. The welfare programs provide universal healthcare, free or subsidized education, including higher education, unemployment benefits, and pensions, which ensure that basic needs like healthcare, education, and housing are met. In jobs, most workers are part of labor unions, and if you happen to own a business and become wildly profitable, you can still make a lot of money, but you'll get heavily taxed. And that taxation comes with a ton of benefits to the average person, like improvements in public infrastructure and access to all the free educational and healthcare benefits that I discussed earlier. These countries are a prime example of how capitalist societies can thrive under the right conditions and not cause too much damage to the citizens or the planet. And this is what we in America need to be advocating for more. We need strong labor protections in place, such as collective bargaining, more unions, and labor market regulations. We need comprehensive welfare programs. We need to prioritize environmental protection and sustainability over mindless consumerism and continue exposing these corrupt companies that are making life worse for the 99%. We need complete overhaul of the government and get these motherfuckers who are easily coerced by money out of office and get the newer generation who actually cares about what the future looks like in, so that we can make more of these possibilities an actual reality in the future. Because right now, the presidents say they're gonna do a lot of this stuff and they promise it, and then nothing actually happens. And you can actually make an impact on a lot of this starting locally in your state. Get involved in local elections and vote for people who are actually dedicated to helping build your cities through these means. Also, I know I basically said that capitalism breeds greed and overconsumption, but it really doesn't have to if you're incentivized to abide by a stronger moral compass. In America, people value growth and productivity over everything. It's instilled into our culture. But if the culture continues to shift as more people understand that it's a very select few people at the top ruining this state of living for the rest of us, and that accumulating wealth should be more about public interest than self-interest, then yeah, maybe the economy will slow down, but it won't be nearly as unpredictable, chaotic, and not nearly as many people would be suffering in America as they are today. It really all depends on what type of business you're trying to build as an entrepreneur and how much you care about what you sell. I obviously have a bit of a bias towards capitalism because it's part of the reason I get to do this, make videos for a living, and own my business, but after doing this for almost a decade, I refuse to sacrifice my morals for more profits. I refuse to take any sponsors that I don't think would genuinely help other people, and as a result, I turn down about 80% of my sponsorship offers, leaving around 6 figures of sponsorship money on the table per year. I've never liked the idea of scaling my business to like hundreds of employees, even though that would create a lot of job opportunities. I know that usually the larger a corporation or company gets, the more that employees are treated like objects and treated unfairly. Look, I know that maybe it isn't realistic for every company to stay as small as I am, but it is possible for every business owner to instill better ethics, morals, and values into their company. And besides the action of instilling better morals and ethics into our future generations of children, which we can and should all do on a personal level, we need to make more of the issues I talked about in this video apparent and start to reform governmental intervention so that CEOs are no longer the real government officials. If you're treated poorly at work and everyone in your company agrees, do more research on starting a labor union and get more involved with things locally. That, along with, of course, finding a way to influence the changes in government to make healthcare and education way more affordable, just like the Nordic countries do. So did capitalism cause most of the world's modern issues? Well, yes, but it also solved many of the world's issues that existed even just 100 years ago. It lifted the world out of feudalism and allowed many more people the opportunity to create a great life for themselves, given that they had more freedom to do so. What I don't think people realize is that no matter what economic system you choose, there's always going to be problems. Life is an endless series of exchanging worse problems for better ones, and I think we've done a pretty decent job at that if we look back on human history. But somewhere along the way, people lost sight of making better problems and only asked themselves, how do we gain as much money and power as quickly as possible? And that's why capitalism is now perceived in such a bad light. There's something much better than our current stage or form of capitalism right now that might not even be referred to as capitalism when it evolves to that in the future. But it likely combines the ability to freely own things while having a strong governmental operation that ensures more equality for everyone and improves the current worsening human dilemma caused by this version of capitalism. So when Gen Z and millennials say they hate capitalism, what they're really saying is that they hate corporate capitalism that puts the power in very few greedy, manipulative, corrupt people's hands who don't care about the livelihoods of others and don't care about the future of the world and want to make everything harder for the average person so they have no resources or energy left to revolt. But that type of system isn't always the result of every capitalist society, as we've now seen. What should and will matter the most moving forward is keeping things in check through social democracy and government intervention while still giving people the freedom to own what they've worked for. I appreciate you guys for making it possible for me to do what I do. Thanks for being a consumer of this channel. Check out this video if you enjoy these video essays, and I'm leaving. I love you guys. Goodbye.